Welcome to Learning Impact on Demand Webinar Series 2020, Solutions for Highly Effective Digital Teaching and Learning in Response to the Accelerated Move to Remote Education. At IMS, we believe in the power of dynamic collaboration as a catalyst for digital innovation and transformation in education. And in this spirit, we're bringing together leaders in our community representing learning institutions and educational technology suppliers to share knowledge and ideas for reimagining the educational experience and exploring new opportunities for shaping the future of teaching and learning. Today's topic is improving student success and intervention strategies with real-time data. Please allow me to introduce our panelists here today. We have with us Rainna Erikson, Project Manager for the Bookshelf Online platform. Rainna.
Hi, nice to meet everyone.
We have Benny Johnson, Director of R&D for Acrobatiq.
Hi everybody, nice to be here.
And we have Rachel Van Campenhout, Learning Science Specialist with the R&D group with Acrobatiq.
Hi everybody, happy to be here as well.
Thank you all very much for joining us. I think, as you as well as anybody are aware, there's a lot of changes going on in education these days, forced on us by circumstance. And that is presenting lots of different opportunities, lots of different challenges, and lots of different ways that we just kind of need to think about or approach education and education technology. And one of the really interesting topics that has really risen to the fore as part of that conversation is around questions of student success, student engagement, and sort of the data that's associated with that and how we can best sort of manage that data or work with that data or capture that data, all of those things. So how has the shift to fully online learning or even hybrid learning and sort of the subsequent increased emphasis on digital resources that has engendered, how has that changed either how you all are thinking about analytics or the kinds of information that you're capturing and using? Rachel, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So, I think this kind of transition to an online learning space that everybody's experiencing right now, it's really one of those places where, we're worried about your students and your retention and how are your students going to perform. And just recently, actually, we began to investigate some of the data that we had on our side, looking to see if we could see from our platform data what might have happened because of a transition during, the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we were able to reach out and work with an instructor. I had the privilege of working with Mary Lou Townsend at Warwick University, our community college. And we were able to kind of take a look at some of those engagement graphs. We were able to talk about what her experiences were. And I think all of us were worried about student retention, right? This dramatic shift and a transition from hybrid face-to-face to virtual entirely. And what we found was that they didn't lose nearly as many students as they were worried they might. And we didn't see this big disruption in the data. And a lot of that they were attributing to, kind of trying to keep factors as consistent as possible for students, same class time, synchronous things, but also having a digital resource that kind of reduced the amount of change for students. But also one that continued to generate data because as Mary Lou had pointed out to me, she was able to use the learning dashboards to continue to monitor her students like she was before, COVID happened. So she knew what they were learning, where they were struggling, and was able to use that real-time data to kind of keep tabs on her class and make sure that, she was able to minimize the disruption and continue to kind of effectively target their learning needs. So, I found that, kind of a really exciting and positive, outcome when we were all, worried about what this impact on students might be.
So kind of following on with that just a little bit and thinking about, you talked about sort of that student engagement element of it and understanding, are the students still engaged? How has that engagement model changed or that engagement strategy changed. And thinking about sort of the relationship between student engagement and student success, because obviously they're related potentially, but not necessarily the same thing. What do you see as the relationship between student engagement and student success, and especially as you think about it in terms of sort of the analytics and the data you're actually able to capture and things?
So here at VitalSource, and I'll jump in first here, student engagement and student success really go hand in hand. We've been doing studies over this over the past few years. We actually did one with a large for-profit university a few years ago now, and they kind of showed that students who engaged with their book within the first week, and these were 5-week courses, and they were able to tell their letter grade by the end of that first week, just based on engagement. Because it didn't necessarily matter that, the amount of pages that they had read over a period of the 5 weeks. It mattered when you were reading, how often you were reading, and when you were taking notes and highlights and making annotations. People who were more engaged with the book and had more study sessions tend to have better success. So it seems like a no-brainer to say, oh, just because you're reading the book, you're going to pass the course. Like, reading is very important, but what we found is reading early and often, and really kind of, not letting it get too far and too late, really does make the difference with a student from letter grade to letter grade, really.
Yeah, to add to that, so we're, Rachel and I are Acrobatiq by VitalSource. We started out as Acrobatiq, and we were acquired by VitalSource, and we were a spinoff of Carnegie Mellon's Open Learning Initiative. And one of the things that we studied heavily, still do, and we base our approach to building courseware on, is the fact that, yes, engagement is essential, and not all kinds of engagement are created equal in terms of the type of learning benefits you get. So, for example, reading is definitely important. Like Rainna said, you need to read early and often. You can't just put it off, right? So that's predictive of success. But while reading is important, reading alone doesn't have the same impact as incorporating practice. So one of the pillars that we develop that comes from our OLI background is to intersperse practice in with the reading itself. So I'd contrast that with, let's read the whole chapter and then answer some questions at the end. Well, that's great too, that's practice. But there's been a lot of recent research that's very exciting that was done at Carnegie Mellon and Ken Kadinger's group on interspersing the practice with the reading. So the idea is, I'll read a little bit, half a page, a few paragraphs, then I'll get a practice question about what I just read. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. These things are typically just simple comprehension questions or just basic practice to make sure that while I'm reading, I'm not just tuning out and reading passively, which is all too easy to do, even if you don't want to. That just happens. And so it was found by Ken that interspersing that practice gets you a lot better return on your study investment. So doing the practice as you go, interleave with your reading, gets an average of about 6 times the learning benefit than just reading alone. And even more exciting, Ken came up with a clever statistical design that shows that that's not just a correlation. It's not just the better students do the practice and get the better grades, but he was able to show that the practice actually causes the better learning benefit. And so that is significant enough. I mean, we all know practice matters. We've known that since day one of education, probably. But the fact that interspersing the practice in with the reading gets better outcomes and also helps to cause them, that's a great finding. And it's got a name. Ken calls it the Doer Effect. And so that's the approach that we take to building our software. So we built it that way with Acrobatiq, now Acrobatiq by VitalSource. We're taking that approach in the courseware that we're working on, generating at scale with some automated artificial intelligence methods at VitalSource. And it's built on making sure that the student has the opportunity to get the benefit of that Doer Effect. So learn by doing approach, but that's how we operationalize it based on the learning science.
Looking at the Doer Effect, looking at the practice element as an important aspect of student success and building that in practice into the learning model. what's the role or the value of analytics then, as we think, you know, what kind of data and how can that data be used as we try to sort of uh, look at that empirically when we think about student success?
Well, I'll start off. There's a lot of ways that we can use analytics, and I think I want to think about this in terms of analytics that we have available for instructors and how those impact students as well, versus maybe analytics that we use kind of internally. And so, you know, for instructors, you know, we have learning dashboards, and they're centered around questions that we want to help instructors answer. How well are my students learning? Where are my students having difficulty? And we're kind of trying to take all of the data that we're generating, and we're putting those into some, you know, sophisticated learning metrics that we want to be actionable for instructors. We want to make things easier so that instructors can look at real-time student progress and know who is struggling and know what they're struggling on. And so that's kind of one of the things that we're doing in our, you know, our data analyses, and we're trying to put them forth in a way that is actionable. But then we also have things that, you know, when we talk about data-driven courseware, students also benefit from that in their actual learning environment. So we were able to just publish some research recently with the Human Computer Interactions Conference, and we investigated the data and how student performance on engagement, which impacts what we generate as learning estimates, predictive measure, and we have adaptive activities, right? And we found that the adaptive activity was beneficial for many students in helping them to both increase their learning estimates as well as mean summative assessment scores. And all of that good stuff that comes out of those adaptive activities is driven because of real-time data that is being gathered for that student, generating those predictive learning estimates. And so that's how we're trying to help them in their learning environment in you know, real time.
Another way that we tend to help, you know, our institutions and our partners with data is that, you know, we do have kind of multiple different ways that we serve up our data to our institutions and our partners. For our bookshelf, we have just, you know, a simple instructor level dashboard. Doesn't have quite as much cool things as the Acrobatiq by VitalSource dashboard, but it gives, you know, some basic metrics of, you know, this is my students are reading this week. This is where I'm losing my students. This is, you know, kind of some key metrics. This is a student that never opened the book. Knowing that a student should open the book in the first couple of weeks, that's a student I should tap who's at a risk of, you know, withdrawing from the course or not succeeding. So we kind of give those basic metrics to instructors. We also have an institution dashboard where they can look and say, hey, you know, this teacher's classes are performing really well. This one's are not. Like, why don't I look at the data across these two and see, you know, are students engaging in one of these versus another? So we have kind of those basic tiers to allow, you know, an overarching view. You know, maybe you're trying to compare books in between two courses. You can go do that in that institutional dashboard. And then you have that instructor level that's really going to try to help that for our student. We collect a lot of data. That's the data that we think is helpful and relevant, you know, as a bookshelf user to kind of give to our institutions and our partners. But we also give it to you in other ways too. So we do have data feeds as well. A lot of times people say, you know, I want everything, give me everything. And so we are able to give people, you know, feeds in a variety of formats, whether it's a periodic or a near real-time feed, like a caliper feed. We're able to do both of those so that schools can really get the data they need and figure out their strategy from there.
I definitely want to come back to the question of the feeds and sort of some of the different ways that those are captured and the different mechanisms. But you mentioned a couple of the metrics just kind of in that discussion real quickly. What are some of the key metrics that you all see as sort of as a baseline for an analytic strategy, thinking both about yourselves and about what an institution might be thinking about as a baseline?
So I always say, what is the question you want to answer? Because with all of this data coming at you, like, there is data paralysis. I've seen it happen to so many different institutions. So it's let's look at what are you trying to answer. If you're trying to answer the question of, which textbook performs better, then you're going to want to take information from multiple different sections, and you're going to want to use that information of, okay, this section used this textbook, this section used this textbook, everything else was the same. What is the engagement? And you're going to want to be able to measure that. But you have to go into this with a question or with some idea of what you're trying to do, what type of metrics you think are going to be useful. Because otherwise it's just rows and columns. So you got to kind of have an idea of where you want to go. If you have a data analyst on board and who can do really cool things, and kind of pull from multiple places, that's great. If you don't have that, there are still ways you can answer your questions, but let's start with the question first, I always say.
And if you want a good question to start with, if you'd like one, I just come back to engagement. Engagement's one of the most important metrics. And if you're not monitoring engagement already, then I guarantee you it's less than you think it is. It always turns out to be the case that engagement's less than not only what you'd like it to be, but it's likely less than what you think it is. So Rachel mentioned a bit ago that we also do some internal analyses that aren't exposed through our dashboards for monitoring performance of students and the quality of our course. So we have a device we call engagement graphs. It's just very simple. We just plot how many students engage with the course in various ways each page of the course. So did they go to the page as a proxy for reading it? If there's any of the formative practice that we talk about is intended to get the Doer Effect, did they engage in that practice, and so on, and a couple of other different things. So we look at those and we see a lot of stuff from that. So we also replicate the Doer Effect studies that I mentioned that Ken and his group do. We've performed Doer Effect analyses on our own Acrobatiq courses, and we found the Doer Effect in all of them that we analyzed. We analyzed 8 or 10 across a variety of subject areas, and some courses get a larger effect, some courses get a smaller effect, but we always see it. But we want to know, are we getting a Doer Effect and what's its magnitude, as a way to indicate, can we improve the course in some way? Is the course not where it needs to be, and maybe not getting the effect that we need? In fact, we did a study with, as a large institutional partner, but it was WGU, Western Governors. Jenna Olson from WGU and I presented a talk at the IMS LILI last year, where we showed that not only do you get the Doer Effect in one of the courses that we studied there, it was a large economics course, but we took it a step further and asked, could we see the Doer Effect persist through to the final exam, WGU's final exam for the course? And we did, which was cool, because wouldn't be guaranteed that we could do that. It's removed from the practice in time, right? Maybe the final is not as perfectly aligned with the course as the practice embedded in the course is. So that's at least a couple of reasons why you might not see a Doer Effect, but we still saw one on the final exam. And so that was pretty cool. We also do some things that are just intended to keep the quality of the course at a high level by just doing anything from old-fashioned item analysis, just policing the data that we get, not to ask, is the student performing well, but are the practice questions doing well? So we do item analysis, we do item response theory, the model that Rachel mentioned earlier that's exposed for student performance and dashboards, item response theory based. But we're continually monitoring the data, and if, for example, some of our items are not performing well psychometrically, we can pull them out and replace them. So we do things like that, housekeeping, but just makes a lot of practical sense to keep the quality of the courses as high as we can.
Several of you have mentioned, all of you, because there were several of you, have mentioned some of the dashboards and things like that that you present. Obviously capturing and analyzing the data is one critical aspect of thinking about analytics, but presenting that data and presenting it in a way that becomes useful is another very important aspect of that. What are some of the ways of thinking about visualizations of data, some of the dashboards or visualizations that have emerged in your practice that have proven to be valuable? Sort of what makes good analytics from a consumer standpoint?
Well, I'll start off with an example. It's actually off of it's an internal tool that we have right now. We call it engagement movies, and again, this was something that came about because we were asking a question internally. We wanted to kind of see, an engagement graph, as you've seen, is plots an entire course section's engagement with the course over time. So you've got along the x-axis the pages of the course, and along the y-axis your students, and then you can see the plot of doing and reading in those little dots that go across. Now, that is often a still frame for an entire course after the fact, and it tells us a lot. But we wanted to know, well, what are students doing in real time? Can we see when spring break hits? Can we see, all of these kinds of things? And so Benny actually, he was able to develop an engagement movie, and it's a little bit like stopgap animation for super nerds. And so what you're going to see is every day we took a still frame of the engagement graph and we put them all together into this movie, and you can watch as you can see students as they engage page by page through the course. And you've always got students who are the first ones in, and they're the first ones doing things, and you've got your go-getter students. And then you're going to see a lag, and you're going to see some students kind of a jump right before a transition maybe to the next unit, and maybe those are your students who are like, oh, I better get in there and do this stuff before they move on without me. And then at some point you're going to see a lift, there's going to be a number of students who come into the course towards the end of it who are, all of a sudden, we're getting to the end of this semester and I haven't cracked the course, and you can see them going through, right? And that told us so much information about students, about their behaviors, about patterns. And this whole thing came about because we had a question, and we wanted, we were just looking for a way to use data to answer it.
Yeah, I would say another, thing when you're trying to look at what you can do and what type of visualizations are helpful for you. We found visualizations that have some type of action attached to them can be helpful. So one thing that, for example, maybe you have a graph that says, 75% of your students have opened your book. Well, that's an action for you that 25% have not. And maybe that's something you want to do there. Or maybe you want to split your students into quartiles. These are your engaging students. These are your non-engaging students. Okay, well, there's an action for you to look at maybe those non-engaging students a little bit more. So if you kind of look at some of that data and some of those questions you want to answer, and you can kind of split it into a way that might generate an action, you're going to have some, success where you're going to take that data and put it into practice.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that got me thinking about, and kind of jumping back to something that Rainna, that you touched on earlier, kind of that idea of seeing the data in real time and being able to plot it over time and actually see it as sort of a living organism. I wanted to come back to that question of capturing data, different ways that you capture data, including the caliper standard from IMS, but sort of what are the sort of infrastructure or architectural elements that go into that are put into place for you all for how you think about actually capturing that data, and how do you make use of standards like caliper to do that?
So we kind of start with the beginning with Bookshop, I would say, of just, we're monitoring page logs. Any click event that you have is being recorded somewhere and it's being put into a database. So we're starting with the basics of, what is a student doing? Where are they moving on the page? Where are they coming from? What is that, all that information? And then what we do is we package it up into, different database files, and we are able to deliver it to people in a variety of ways. If you're maybe just new to data, you might want this in a CSV file. We can give you a periodic feed with a CSV file. You don't need to jump right into a format you're not comfortable with yet. But what's really cool is being able to deliver it via caliper, because if you have a caliper feed, you can take the data that I give you at VitalSource, and you can take data that maybe you get from Blackboard or Canvas, and you can take the data you get from, I don't know, a McGraw-Hill course that you're taking, and you can take all of this data and you can take it all for one student and translate it. And so instead of saying, oh, we're like normally you'd be like, oh, I might have an Excel doc of this, and maybe in this system this person's called a user, and in this system this person's called a student, in this system, and, you know, it's easier to say, hey, it's all named the same, it's all a standard convention, so you can really get cool on the data and track a user's journey through different platforms. And that's how you can really measure their engagement, because, you know, maybe they're not reading the textbook in VitalSource, but maybe that doesn't matter because maybe they're doing all this other stuff that you don't know about if you were just looking at the VitalSource data. So that's kind of what's cool about, like, if you can get a little further into that data of how you can track someone across multiple systems and really see their engagement level and see, you know, where they are kind of moving through and what they're doing. And you can then answer some of those questions of, you know, what really is, you know, Rainna Erikson's engagement? Okay, well, she might not be engaging here, but she's engaging a lot there. That might, in my mind, put her at less risk than somebody who's, you know, engaging in some other fashion.
Well, we've very quickly moved through a lot of information, and so I wanted to just take kind of a last moment to, you know, again, thinking about our institutional members that may be viewing this and the institutions that you all work with, as a supplier to them and as a partner with them. We have institutions, you know, we have the full spectrum of institutions when it comes to thinking about this stuff. We have folks that are, you know, extremely sophisticated and mature in their analytics models and have great infrastructure and ability to consume enormous amounts of data and data scientists on board. And we have institutions that are really just beginning their journey in this particular world, sometimes not even entirely sure where to get started, how to start thinking about analytics, and how that might benefit them. Speaking especially to that latter group, to the folks that are sort of at the beginning of their journey here, is there one thing, what's one thing that you might suggest to them or point them toward or tell them to think about as they start this process? And I'll just kind of go down the line if that's okay. So Rainna, maybe start with you.
Sure. So what I would say is, you know, I know people don't have a lot of time, they're busy, data's new, they don't know where to begin. What I would say is, you know, if you have the time in the first 2 weeks of your course or 3 weeks of your course, that's really when you should be checking in on those students and seeing who's succeeding and who's opening their book, who's engaging, because that can mean the difference between a letter grade. Now, if you're in the middle of your semester and, you know, that advice is moot because I just gave you advice that's not relevant, what Benny and Rachel have been talking about with the Doer Effect, a student can make up a lot of ground if they do a lot of practice. So what kind of practice can they do? Don't just have them read the book, but say, okay, if you're just starting to read the book now, or you're just starting to engage now, let's talk about engagement practices that you can do that will help you gain some ground because you've lost it as of now.
Okay, excellent. Benny, how about you?
So yeah, to keep on that thread, internally at Acrobatiq, we developed a lot of at-risk models to do various things like predict, are you going to pass the final exam based on your engagement in the course, or based on your engagement early on, like Rainna was talking about, are you going to stay in or drop out, right? And so one thing that we see, which is really, you know, it breaks your heart for students. Some students who are struggling, it seems like their instinct is, I know I'm not getting this, I'll just go back and read it again and again and again and again. And this will be in an Acrobatiq course where this you know, formative practice intended to get the Doer Effect is included, but they think that the best thing to do is just reread, right? So they'll be spending a lot of extra study time, but they'll be investing it in reading and not doing. And unfortunately, the model shows that lots of reading is not predictive of success. And so that's one of the things that we're working on, even in our own platform, is to do some nudging to detect students like that suggested to do practice. But I would say the recommendation for an instructor who's just getting into all this is look at simple analytics. Start simple. Don't try to do it all at once. Look at things like Rainna said, look at, are they engaging early on, because that's predictive of success. Are they engaging and putting their study time into things that are going to be more effective, like the formative practice? We're not saying don't read. We're saying if you practice while you read, then you get 6 times better the investment a return on your investment of study time. And that's why I mentioned those students who just reread and reread and reread, but they don't practice, right? So if someone, again, we're working on our platform doing that, you know, directly, but if someone would just point out, look, you know, you need to be doing this practice, and that's, if you spent just some time practicing instead of doing all this reading, you're going to get better results. But I'd say pick something simple that's practical to do, like the things that we've suggested here, and stick with it, right? Doing something simple and sticking with it is going to be a lot better than trying to do too much, or you know, worrying that you're not doing enough, and then you get discouraged and stop doing it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Benny. Rachel, how about from you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't stress Benny's advice. You know, focus on one simple thing. You know, if it's engagement, that's great. But for me, I think I would say, you know, have patience and have persistence, especially if this is new. If you've got, you know, data, and we would like to think that, you know, you have this new technology, or you have a way, you have data, and suddenly there's, you know, it's the magic bullet, right? And all of our problems are solved, and all of our students are just gonna, you know, now do wonderfully. But you know, it takes time for both instructors and students to get into these new mindsets and habits of doing practice, of engaging early and often, to get this doer effect. And so I would say, you know, spend the time with your students to explain these things and help them understand that it's important, and be persistent. And you'll see, you know, even year after year, engaging and becoming more familiar with these things, you'll see that, you know, as an instructor, you get more effective at, you know, working with these things, using your visualizations or your data, as well as, you know, helping to incorporate these things into your teaching practice. And for students, it takes time for them to get into these new habits. So, you know, being persistent with them over the course of a semester, and making sure that they understand how critical these things are is also something that, you know, you can do and incorporate into your practice.
Well, thank you so much, Rainna, Benny, Rachel. Thank you for being a part of this panel. Thank you for the expertise and the information you bring to it. I strongly suspect that it's going to be enormously helpful to a lot of the institutions out there, and their faculty and instructors who are struggling to figure out how to better operate and maybe make some improvements under the current conditions out there. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to talking with you more about some of these topics, hopefully in the future.